Hello everybody, it's Riff Raff Hornhelm, and I'm back again with another presentation from the Dwarven Vault. And today is a monster review. It's more of a final review for all these entry-level subterranean creatures that are running around on two legs and show some ability brain-wise, though not very much, and really how they rank, and a little bit of background information about some of these in terms of usage in a dungeon. Now remember, back in the early days, and that's what we're talking about here, are creatures from the original monster manual for AD&D from the late 1970s. And things have obviously changed a great deal with 5e over time. But if you're looking for a first principles and how this all started and what it was like, you really need to go back to the original Dungeons and Dragons, and you need to put your mind in the place where gaming was at that time. But for the creatures we're talking about, we're really talking about ranking all these little annoying subterranean creatures that are generally not too difficult to kill, that encompass essentially first to third level as dungeons were looked at that time, and include the kobold and the orc, goblin, hobgoblin, the troglodyte, and the bugbear. Now, all of those creatures have their goods and bads depending on what level you are as a player character. Kobolds are certainly the easiest ones to deal with. All of these, with the probable exceptions of troglodytes and kobolds, are available or usable for pushing forward plot details, allowing interaction between your characters and whatever group of creatures they happen to be. Now, the reason that kobolds aren't particularly good on that side is they are at the absolute low end of the intelligence scale. Think single words and not stringing together any complex ideas or thoughts. And troglodytes at the other end are so primitive that their knowledge level and their ability to communicate and interact with others is far more limited. Now, if you look at all of these creatures, the hit dice, once again, determines where they are within a dungeon. That's the way it was done originally. So if you're on the second level of a dungeon, you could run into gnolls, or you could run into hobgoblins. And you could certainly run into the lower level ones as well, but you weren't able to run into a bugbear until you got to the third level. I know, really silly by today's standards, but once again, part of the problem here is learning where people came from. RPGs were a pretty new concept at the time, and the idea of playing was obviously meant to be a medieval type fantasy, number one. And by the name Dungeons and Dragons, the emphasis was going to be on fantastical creatures and dank, dark, underground dungeon settings. And originally, that's really the way the game was. It expanded over time and took in so many more venues, but in the beginning, you pretty much just had a place that had stuff in it. There might be a story that goes behind the place, but there was generally not the all-encompassing world views and world building and so forth. That wasn't there in the very earliest days of Dungeons and Dragons. That came along as we went. Yes, I know there's some that was done by Gygax and so forth, but that also just evolved from existing dungeons. Now, when we look at all of these different types of creatures, one of the things that I've been asked about in a couple of cases is, well, why haven't you included other low-level creatures? Specifically, dwarves and gnomes. There's a couple reasons for that. Originally, Dungeons and Dragons was really seen as a battle between good and evil. The idea of playing evil characters, while it was an intriguing thought, didn't work very well because you couldn't have a mix of alignments within a party. Not extreme mix. You couldn't have a lawful evil anti-paladin in a group of other player characters. And of course, in the original D&D, paladin didn't come along instantly. First there was just the fighter. Now, if you wanted to have a group that was evil, you had other problems that generally made it unattractive to play. If you were in a typical medieval fantasy setting, most of the places you were going to were filled with people whose alignment would be the antithesis of what you were or what your fellow party members might be. So this tended to drive everybody to play good versus evil. So when you went into a dungeon, if you ran into dwarves, well, in the original game, in the monster manual, they're lawful good. Now, characters can be an assortment of different alignments, and you'll see that as explained in the player's manual for the dwarf as a player character. But within the context of using them as a monster or as a creature within the game, just a general space filler, they were supposed to be lawful good. Now, gnomes is another one. In the game, as part of the monster manual, they run from neutral to lawful good. So they have a little bit more flexibility. But you're still not very likely to run into them as an opponent. And what I was looking at, and what I'm going to continue to look at, is what would your typical opponents be based on being a player character, based on the original offerings for the different creature types that were available as player characters. So elves and humans, and yes, gnomes were in there too, dwarves, of course, the best. But you still played somebody who was on the good side. Now you can go back and look at any of the videos that we did regarding the characters that I've mentioned in here, excluding the dwarf and the gnome. Well, I think Cranky did one on the gnome. But in any case, the ones that we looked at from a DM's perspective, and certainly from my personal view perspective as both a DM and a player, when you look at this group, and once again, kobold, orc, goblin, hobgoblin, troglodyte, gnoll, and bugbear. The one I think is the most dangerous from this whole group is the troglodyte. And I think that's a pretty easy decision to reach when you look at what they're capable of versus any of the others that I've mentioned. They're one of the few that have some additional abilities. They can camouflage themselves, making it very difficult to be seen, and also allowing them to set up a hell of a good ambush. And in addition to this, they have that secretion that saps the energy of the people who are trying to fight them, cumulatively and relatively quickly. Folks, if you're looking to populate your dungeon with something that's a little bit more challenging and yet still low level, they don't have very many hit points, and they don't have any real special defenses. Their armor class is not high, but at the same time, I think they're the most dangerous. So if you're looking to add something dangerous, try a troglodyte. The most interesting thing from my perspective as a DM is when you throw that at people, they really have no idea what the hell it is, which I find kind of amazing. It's kind of a shame that more folks don't know what troglodytes are, but it's because they rarely get used. That's one to keep in mind. It's a good surprise for your player characters. If they've never seen one before, they're in for, well, shall we say, an interesting time. May end up getting a dwarvenoscopy out of it. Oh well. So that's how I rank them. I think they're all good, useful creatures and a lot of fun. If nothing else, they provide a lot of practice for your characters in killing things. That's always fun. And like I said, the dwarf and the gnome, I wouldn't add this into the group because I don't see them as an opponent. I see them as allies or friends. And we're looking for the opponent you're likely to run into in an early dungeon. Hope you found that interesting. If you did, consider giving us a like, share with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe. For God's sakes, you don't want to miss any of this, do you? Okay, maybe you do. And hopefully we'll see you again here real soon. Take care, everyone, and remember, dwarves rock!